Welcome to Wife Cheating Story. I hope you have an enjoyable and relaxing time listening. Let's get started.
My name is Marcus Wynn, and for 10 years I poured my soul, my curiosity, and every ounce of my technical knowledge into Ardenix Dynamics, a company my father-in-law, Frederick, founded in a dusty basement with nothing but soldering wire and a dream. Back then, the world beyond that basement was a blur of skepticism and doubt. Yet Frederick believed in the power of an idea nurtured by quiet dedication, so he and I soldered circuit boards and sketched patent diagrams under a single bare bulb. I didn't come from a flashy background. I learned electronics by tearing apart broken radios in my father's garage, so my hands moved over resistors and capacitors like a pianist's across ivory keys. Frederick recognized that steadiness in me, the fact that while others chased headlines, I chased reliability, performance, and precision. He taught me early on that noise could never substitute for substance. Yet the moment Ardenix Dynamics moved from that basement to a high-rise suite with floor-to-ceiling windows, my role in the company changed. My wife, Clarice, her brother Troy, and her sister Mia arrived with champagne toast and buzzwords. They believed that the right selfie at the right expo would eclipse the months I spent teaching a microcontroller to regulate heart rhythms. When Clarice announced our engagement at a gala, she made sure the press release highlighted her charitable foundation partnership. Troy, with his trademark slicked-back hair, talked up market disruption strategies at investor lunches. Mia, ever the showrunner, choreographed product launches like Hollywood red carpet events. Their voices filled every corridor of Ardenix. Mine was the one they barely heard. They never saw me as an equal. At strategy sessions, they dominated the conversation with bravado, Clarice passionately outlining signature events, Troy pontificating on brand perception metrics, Mia dazzling with viral campaign projections. I paid attention. I took notes. I logged every question, every requirement, every glitch in the prototypes. I'd stayed up all night debugging. While they rallied focus groups, I reverse-engineered feedback and retooled drivers until our devices performed flawlessly in simulations. This marriage of hype and hardware fascinated me. They fed off public attention, I fed off circuit diagrams. But instead of valuing that balance, they assumed my quiet insistence on excellence stemmed from timidity. I didn't argue back. Words bounce off the thick glass walls of confidence, but data never lies. So I documented. I built. I listened. When a wireless neural interface lost calibration in extreme temperatures, I was in the lab with my pencil behind my ear, hypothesizing heat exchange coefficients and redesigning thermal shields. When a $1,000 coffee machine broke in the executive lounge, I fixed it with a precision screwdriver and a spool of solder, earning a grateful nod from the receptionist rather than a front-page announcement. They saw me as the silent caretaker of the company's behind-the-scenes machinery, not as the architect of its future. At family dinners, they joked that I was just the quiet engineer married into the dynasty, the odd one out, as Troy liked to say with a mocking grin, while Clarice and Mia laughed at their brother's wit. My presence barely registered beyond the polite smile I offered at the head of the table. Where they adorned themselves with flashy jewelry, I wore a simple silver watch that doubled as a prototype heart rate monitor. They believed that charisma equaled competence, but I believed in craftsmanship so precise that every resistor, every transistor, every line of code carried my signature. I was content to let results speak louder than press releases. Still, the quietness that was my shield became their weapon. They assumed my unassuming demeanor equated to weakness. Marcus is fine tinkering in the background, Troy would say when decisions needed to be justified. If we need real leadership, we know where to look. Their laughter echoed down corridors I once roamed freely. I retreated further into the lab, where the hum of machines welcomed me more than the hollow applause of an audience. My colleagues in R&D trusted me. They would knock on my door at odd hours, urgently waving failures from the assembly line, and I would meet them at the benches with calm focus, sketching alternative schematics. Outside those doors, my family saw me as expendable. Yet every time they overlooked a patent clause or bickered over marketing collateral, I was busy drafting the legal filings that would protect our inventions. Each algorithm I optimized, each microchip I tested, became another stitch in a digital tapestry that I alone understood in its entirety. I memorized filing deadlines, researched international standards, and registered our designs under my name for reasons Frederick hinted at but never fully explained. I trusted him. He had built Ardenix from the ground up and recognized that while branding could draw crowds, intellectual property was what transformed a basement dream into a global enterprise. That basement dream carried more weight in my quiet hands than all the expos and press junkets combined. When I discovered a more efficient way to minimize signal interference in our neural stabilizer chip, my heart raced, not because I craved recognition, but because I knew I was unlocking the next leap forward in medical technology. Clarice saw the prototype and nodded politely, her mind already racing to rebrand it in softer tones for a consumer launch. Troy envisioned a splashy keynote announcement. Mia pictured a viral teaser campaign. I pictured the patients whose lives would stabilize when our device worked flawlessly. They may have mistaken my silence for submission, but within that silence I held the keys to Ardenix Dynamics' future. Every late-night formula tweak, every patent revision, every field test that lasted until dawn, all of it was my quiet rebellion against being outnumbered in my own home. They counted on the loud to lead, but I understood that true leadership often resided in the least conspicuous corners, where the real work of invention takes shape in solitude. And as long as I kept building, listening, and documenting, I knew my quiet strength would one day speak volumes. 900 words later, I remain outnumbered in voice but never in vision. The basement blueprint still lives inside me, compelling me toward the next breakthrough. And they have no idea how close I am to turning their misjudgment into my greatest triumph. When Frederick suffered his stroke, the air in Ardenix Dynamics shifted before anyone uttered a word. I was in the lab calibrating the pressure sensors on our cardiac stabilizer prototypes when Dennis Hawthorne burst through the door, his suit jacket flapping like a startled bird's wings. He gripped my arm with trembling fingers and hissed, "They're moving against you." Before I could ask what he meant, the corridors echoed with hushed footsteps and the heavy click of Clarice's heels. I left my workstation, tucked my pencil behind my ear, and followed Dennis into the glass-walled executive suite, where the board assembled like hunters surrounding wounded prey. Troy stood at the head of the table, his back ramrod straight, chin tilted upward in triumph. Mia was seated beside him, her eyes fixed on the screens projecting quarterly revenue graphs. Graphs she had redesigned to look rosier than reality. Clarice leaned forward in her chair, her fingers entwined as if in prayer, though her lips curved in a faint smirk. Nobody spared me a glance. The room's antiseptic brightness felt like interrogation lights. I realized then that Ardenix Dynamics had become a stage for their power plays, and I, the quiet engineer, was the humiliating intermission they'd planned to cancel. Troy slammed a folder onto the table, rattling the polished surface. Effective immediately, Marcus Wynn is relieved of all executive responsibilities, he announced. His voice carried across the glass as loudly as any broadcast. Behind him, Mia tapped her manicured nail against her tablet, eyes dancing with vindication. Clarice didn't even raise her gaze. She simply nodded in agreement, as though the decision was a foregone conclusion. Dennis cleared his throat, pushing his spectacles up the bridge of his nose. "Procedurally, we're in compliance," he said, voice wavering. "Marcus will receive severance and advisory stock options." I felt nothing at first, a dispassionate observer to my own downfall. My mind cataloged every detail, the stark whiteness of the chairs, the dull gleam of the conference table, the faint hum of the HVAC system. Then a familiar calm spread through me, as though I was still deep within that basement lab. I recalled Frederick's words about value and ownership, and how our patents had been etched under my name long ago. The realization sparked a thrill so quiet I almost missed it. I was not powerless. They believed I had been relegated to the margins, but they had not accounted for the foundation I'd quietly laid. Troy flicked his gaze toward me, expecting outrage. "Any questions?" he asked, voice silky with triumph. Clarice's lips parted as if to cheer her brother on. Even Mia looked up then, curiosity mingled with disbelief in her eyes. I straightened, smoothing the front of my lab coat as though preparing for a final demonstration. My voice emerged measured, calm, and utterly unhurried. "Yes," I said. "I have one." They leaned forward, hungrily anticipating my panic. But instead of anger, I offered a half-smile. "Where did you think the company's critical patents were filed?" Uncertainty flickered across Troy's face, replaced quickly by annoyance. "What are you talking about?" he spat. Mia's fingers stilled on her tablet. Clarice frowned, her composed facade momentarily cracking. Dennis shifted uneasily, clearing his throat again. Ardenix holds all the patents, he began, but I interrupted. You mean Ardenix holds what you've licensed from me? I said, letting the words hang in the air like smoke rings. Every neural interface, every stabilizer chip, every precision feedback module. Those patents are under my name, not the company's. Ardenix Dynamics has only licensed them under terms that are fully revocable. I saw Troy's face blanch, Mia's jaw go slack, Clarice's nod freeze in midair. Each of them realized, in that instant, that they had been celebrating a victory built on sand. Silence stretched taut, then shattered under the weight of my next words. You just removed the one person with irrevocable rights to every piece of technology holding this company together. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a stack of documents, certified patent registrations bearing my signature, complete with clauses granting me inventor control in case of leadership breaches. Frederick insisted we do this when the company was small, I said softly. He warned me that branding attracts attention, but intellectual property ensures survival. I tapped the top sheet. As of today, Ardenix cannot manufacture, sell, or even test these devices without my written consent. They gasped in unison. Troy's shoulders slumped. Mia looked as though she'd swallowed a shard of glass. Clarice pressed her fingers to her lips, her eyes glossy with shock. Dennis shuffled papers, unable to maintain his professional composure. I set the documents on the table, stepping back until my reflection in the glass showed me standing alone against the horizon of their disbelief. And now, I said, voice steady as the hum of a running circuit, we can discuss how you want to proceed. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving behind a boardroom in chaos, a family reeling from its own machinations, and a silent engineer who had finally reclaimed his power. They had staged a bloodless coup to oust me, but in doing so they had unleashed the very force they sought to contain. No flashy expo, no viral campaign could reverse the tide I had set in motion through quiet diligence. And as the doors closed behind me, I knew Ardenix Dynamics would never recover from the coup they had tried to deliver, because it was mine to command all along. I moved through the aisles of the R&D wing like a man performing a ritual he had practiced in his mind countless times, though never under the harsh fluorescence of an office building. My hand shook only slightly as I lifted framed family photos from my desk. Clarice and me on our wedding day, me holding a prototype board at a late-night demo, a candid snapshot of Frederick and me toasting solder fumes in the old basement. I placed each picture carefully into a reinforced cardboard box stamped with my name. As I wrapped the thick stack of patent blueprints in acid-free sleeves, my mind replayed the moment Troy had delivered the board's verdict. Marcus Wynn is relieved of executive responsibilities, effective immediately. My breathing slowed, matching the steady hum of the ventilation system, and I reminded myself that I was not walking out of Ardenix Dynamics. I was stepping into a future I had already secured. I reached for the wooden model of our first neural stabilizer chip, the one that had saved a research subject from a fatal arrhythmia during early clinical trials. This chip was my genius and my confession, a testament to nights spent insulating microscopic traces of metal with epoxy and recalibrating signal thresholds to the nanovolt. I held it in my palm, feeling its carved grooves and faint warmth where the laboratory lamps had lingered over it. Tucking it into a custom foam-lined case, I took a moment to breathe in the faint scent of flux and patience that clung to its contours. This was more than hardware. It was my legacy. As I clicked the latch shut, I felt the weight of their ignorance settle behind me, blissful ignorance, because they thought they had banished me. The laughter broke through the calm of my packing. It bloomed from the open door of the central conference room like a boisterous skunk, dripping arrogance down the polished hallway. I froze, listening to Troy's voice ring out in brutish triumph. Can't believe he thought he was one of us. A silent lab rat with no spine. Behind his mocking tone, I could hear Mia's tinkling giggle and Clarice's satisfied sigh. A pang of something that felt like regret, sharper than anger, stung my chest. I remembered the bride I married, the promises whispered beneath cathedral arches, and wondered how few of those promises had stood the test of profit and power. Still, I did not slam any doors. I did not hurl boxes down the corridor. I kept my hands steady and continued placing my personal items. My notebook of half-finished circuit diagrams, the vintage fountain pen Frederick had given me, and the unassuming silver band I wore as a reminder that my greatest title was inventor, not interloper. While they celebrated their new era of noise and glitter, I finished packing the last of my belongings. Then I turned to the lab bench, where my soldering iron lay dormant, its tip cold without a circuit to warm it. On that bench rested the final prototype for the neural stabilizer chip, the very design that would define Ardenix's next generation of life-saving devices. I lifted the prototype with reverence, as though it were a fragile bird about to be set free. As I tucked it into my leather briefcase, I whispered into the hushed vacuum of the empty lab, "I'm not saying goodbye. I'm saying, until we meet again on my terms." I closed the briefcase and slung it over my shoulder. For a moment, I simply stood there, gazing at the bank of oscilloscopes and waveform monitors that had been my companions for years. The screens glowed faintly, as if longing for the currents I had once coaxed through their circuits. I tapped the familiar power button on one monitor. It blinked to life, then went dark again, waiting for the next command. That was when realization crystallized in my mind. While they threw a party to celebrate my departure, they overlooked the crucial fact that gave me all the leverage. Frederick, the man who had built Ardenix from soldering wire and conviction, had taught me that real value lay not in banners or champagne, but in protection, ownership, and registration. They had marched me down the hallway into oblivion, but those patents I filed under my name, complete with irrevocable inventor control clauses, were the lock and key to every product Ardenix Dynamics sold. They had assumed that my silence meant acquiescence, that because I did not contest every insult, I would not safeguard the intellectual property I had alone authored. They were wrong. I walked to the elevator banks, using the service lift to avoid the grand staircase where executives traditionally flash their designer watches. As the doors slid closed, I pictured the boardroom behind me in upheaval. The shock on Troy's face, the horror in Mia's eyes, the guilt and betrayal flickering across Clarice's expression when she realized her vote had forfeited her own stake in the company's future. The brief hum of the elevator car carried me down to the lobby, where Dennis Hawthorne stood, eyes wide and breathless. He attempted a brief nod of respect, an unsteady acknowledgement that I had outmaneuvered their corporate coup with a quiet pen stroke years earlier. I offered him a curt nod in return, shouldered my briefcase, and stepped into the outside world. The revolving doors turned behind me, sealing the fate of the high-gloss offices I had helped to build. As I walked across the plaza toward my car, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. They believed they had crushed me, but in truth, they had only uprooted themselves from the foundation I had laid. Frederick had whispered once, branding builds attention, but patents build legacies. Now, the legacy was safe in my briefcase, and the company that had tried to silence me would soon discover that its heart, the technology it claimed to own, beat only because I allowed it to. In that moment, out in the open air, I felt neither celebratory triumph nor hollow victory. Instead, I felt purpose, unyielding and clear. I was the silent keeper of Ardenix Dynamics' fate, and they would learn, in due course, that when you underestimate the quiet one, you hand him the master key. I was in my home office 2 weeks after the board's coup, standing at the breakfast bar in my pajamas and apron, whisking pancake batter as sunlight filtered through the blinds. My briefcase, still heavy with prototypes and patent files, leaned against the wall. I had set up a makeshift lab here, a single bench cluttered with circuit boards, oscilloscopes, and a soldering iron that sat cold since I left Ardenix Dynamics. My phone lay face up on the counter, silent until that moment. When it vibrated, I glanced at the display, Dennis Hawthorne, Ardenix's head legal counsel. My pulse ticked up a notch. Dennis rarely called outside office hours unless something had gone horribly wrong. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and tapped the answer button. Dennis's voice came rushing through the line, breathless, urgent. "Marcus, you need to come in. Now. We have a situation. A catastrophe, actually." He exhaled sharply. "It's about the patents." I paused mid-flip, pancake batter dripping from my whisk. "Dennis, I'm off the clock. I made a deal." I forced calm into my tone. "Explain in one sentence." Another ragged breath. "Your name's everywhere. Those patents you filed, you have clauses we didn't anticipate." He swallowed. "I tried to license just one of the new neural stabilizer variants, and the licensing office flagged it. They asked who the inventor was, and your name popped up without Ardenix listed as co-inventor." His voice sounded hollow, like he was speaking down a well. "We can't produce anything. Every contract is under your control." A flip chart spun through my mind. The patent filings, The clauses that granted me irrevocable ownership, the founder's charter Frederick insisted on. I'd taken his instructions literally. File under my name, secure the inventions, and add inventor control provisions to protect the company in case of a leadership breach. Troy and Clarice had scoffed at the notion. Mia never bothered reading dusty legal text. They believed branding and buzz mattered more than buried filings. Now the joke was theirs. I set the pancake pan aside, heat off, and grabbed my shirt from the back of a chair. As I pulled it on, Dennis continued, the licensing boards are refusing Ardenix's application. They say you have sole authority to grant production rights. They want your signature. And they're not budging. He exhaled again. Production lines are grinding to a halt. Investors are calling. The PR fallout is imminent. I flexed my fingers as I buttoned my shirt. The familiar flicker of adrenaline surged through my veins. This was the moment Frederick had warned about, the quiet leverage hidden in legal fine print. I shook out my sleeves and replied, I'm on my way. I hung up, grabbed my briefcase, and locked down the makeshift lab. The circuits and soldering irons inside stayed untouched, but my prototypes were packed and ready. Driving to Ardenix's headquarters, I replayed the cascade of events that led here. They had thought tossing me aside would silence my influence. Instead, they awakened the sleeping giant of corporate control. I arrived at the glass tower, now echoing corridors and empty offices where my laughter once mingled with the hum of servers. Security waved me through. Word had circulated that I was coming. Dennis met me at the entrance, suit rumpled, tie askew. His relief at seeing me alive rivaled the panic in his eyes. He motioned toward the elevators. It's on the top floor. They called an emergency executive committee meeting. In the boardroom, I paused at the threshold. Clarice sat next to Troy, their expression shifting from triumphant to terrified when they saw me. Mia hovered by the wall, clutching her tablet. The screens behind them displayed red alerts. Production halted, investors withdrawing, patent dispute, urgent. Papers were strewn across the table. A half-finished cup of coffee steamed in front of Mia. Troy rose, face drained of color. Marcus. I'm sorry, he started, voice cracking under the weight of his earlier hubris. Clarice's eyes brimmed with regret. Mia bit her lip. Dennis cleared his throat. They need your direction. The licensing board will only negotiate with you. I crossed the room, each step measured. The polished floor reflected my silhouette as I reached the head of the table. I placed my briefcase down and opened it, revealing the prototypes and patent binders. You revoked my executive duties, I said softly, voice steady as clockwork. You dismissed me in the board vote you orchestrated. And then you tried to license technology that belongs to me. I laid the documents flat. Every patent, every claim, every revision is under my name. Ardenix holds a license that I alone can revoke. Clarice's voice trembled as she asked, why didn't you tell us this before? My gaze met hers. I could see heartbreak and shame mingling in her eyes. Because you never asked, I answered. You assumed silence was compliance. I placed a hand on the stack of files. Let's fix this. We can renegotiate with the licensing board. You reinstate me with the authority to sign all necessary documents. You ratify my position as Chief Innovation Officer. You acknowledge my rights as inventor. Troy swallowed and nodded. Yes, of course. Mia exhaled, relief softening her shoulders. Dennis passed me a fresh coffee. I signed the ratification documents and the licensing agreements in one swift session, my signature like an unexpected storm breaking their drought of oversight. As I stamped patents with official seals, the red alert screens flickered to green. Production resumed, licensing secured, investors reassured. The air in the room shifted. The executives who had banished me now gathered around, deferring to my authority. Clarice reached for my hand, voice choked. I didn't understand. I'm sorry I ever doubted you. I squeezed her hand, words deliberate. Innovation isn't about volume. It's about value. We needed both. When the meeting adjourned, I packed my briefcase again, prototypes secure, patents protected, company crisis averted. As I left the boardroom, Troy murmured, "You're why Ardenix exists." I allowed a satisfied smile. Outside, Dennis caught up with me. He clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You saved the company." I looked up at the tower's reflective facade, the early afternoon sun shimmering across its surface. In that moment, I felt the quiet certainty that had guided me since that basement lab. While noise can attract attention, silence holds the power to protect and the wisdom to prevail. And in mastering that silence, I had mastered Ardenix Dynamics itself. I strode through the glass foyer of Ardenix Dynamics with the certainty of a man returning to reclaim territory he had never truly lost. The polished marble floor glinted beneath my shoes, each step echoing the quiet resolve that had carried me through the past fortnight. Security recognized my briefcase first, pausing me for a nod before allowing access to the executive elevator. As the door slid shut, I rehearsed the words I would speak, the evidence I would present, and the calm authority I would embody. This emergency meeting would determine Ardenix's fate, and I knew exactly where the power lay. When the elevator doors opened onto the 25th floor, I found the conference room door ajar, the low murmur of anxious voices drifting through the gap. I paused, straightened my tie, and stepped inside. Immediately, a hush fell over the assembled board and senior executives. Troy sat at the head of the table, his face more drawn and colorless than usual. Mia's tablet lay open before her, charts red with failure projections. Clarice sat beside them, shoulders hunched, eyes clouded with guilt. Dennis hovered at the back, fidgeting with folders stamped urgent. I set my briefcase on the table, the metallic click of its combination lock punctuating the silence. Troy cleared his throat, voice brittle. "Marcus, thank you for coming." He offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. I nodded, unclasping the briefcase and setting the foam-lined prototype cases gently on the polished wood. I then placed the bound patent documents next to them, the crisp white spines bearing my name in bold type. "You called this meeting," I reminded them softly. "What's the situation?" Mia exchanged a glance with Troy before speaking. "Production has completely halted. Suppliers are demanding clarification on who has authority to approve manufacture. Investors, they've pulled back on our Series C funding until we resolve the patent ownership issue." She tapped her tablet, and the screen displayed a cascade of red alerts. Manufacturing license suspended, patent litigation threat, revenue projections cut by 40%. She met my gaze with desperation. "We need your signature. We need you to tell them Ardenix Dynamics has the rights." I watched Clarice lower her head, clasping her hands in her lap. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the overhead lights. Then Troy leaned forward, voice thick with forced optimism. "The board asks that you waive your inventor control clause, allow us to operate as if the patents belong to Ardenix, and we'll amend the founder's charter to acknowledge you as COO of innovation." He paused. "It's a fair compromise." I assessed them each in turn. Troy, the self-appointed CEO whose understanding of technology began and ended at buzzwords. Mia, whose marketing genius had produced glittering campaigns but no working devices. And Clarice, my wife, whose loyalty had faltered when power was at stake. They offered a compromise that conceded nothing to my rightful ownership. It felt perfunctory, an attempt to paper over a gaping wound. So I picked up the top patent binder and opened it to the clause in question. My hand hovered above the page, the scent of fresh ink mingling with the sterile corporate air. "You misunderstand," I said evenly. "The Founder's Charter already names me Chief Innovation Officer with irrevocable rights to all inventions. You can't amend that unilaterally." I traced a finger down the clause granting me inventor control should executive leadership attempt to override the original filing. "This isn't negotiable, because it was never meant to be." Frederick insisted, before his stroke, that the bones of Ardenix be held by the person building them. Troy's jaw clenched. "You're being difficult." He waved at the halted production graphs. "Promises to clients are drying up. We're bleeding money. We need a quick fix." His glare sought to coerce me with the weight of their desperation. I closed the binder deliberately, the thud echoing across the table. "A quick fix would be to use a forged signature," I replied softly. "But I've never forged anything in my life." The room stiffened. I unzipped my briefcase and withdrew a confidential memo from the legal department, one I had drafted before leaving Ardenix's offices. The memo detailed the licensing office's inquiries and Ardenix's improper instructions. "License under corporate name only. Do not disclose inventor details." That misstep, I said, had alerted regulators that Ardenix had attempted to conceal the true inventor. The fallout was now fully visible in the red alerts across Mia's tablet. "We can't move forward until the record is corrected," I said. "Ardenix must acknowledge my inventor status in every licensing application, grant me sole authority to approve productions, and reaffirm those terms in a board resolution. After that, we can reapply, and production will resume." I paused, letting the magnitude of my conditions settle in. I will not waive my rights, because if I do, I lose the very leverage needed to protect the company from future power grabs. Clarice looked up, tears brimming. Marcus, please. I never wanted it to come to this. She clasped her hands to her chest. I thought I was doing what was best for us. I softened my tone. You did what you thought was best when you pushed me out. I'm asking now that you place value on what I do best, securing our technology so Ardenix can survive. Not flashy launches, not viral marketing stunts, real, tangible innovation that saves lives. I closed the binder and rose, gathering my documents. I'm prepared to lead this rescue. But you must formally restore my authority. Troy buried his face in his hands. Mia exhaled, relief softening her shoulders. Dennis let out a shaky breath. Clarice reached across the table, squeezing my hand. We agree, she whispered. We want you fully reinstated. I nodded, setting the memo and binders back into my briefcase with careful precision. Draw up the board resolution, I said. I'll review it. Then we'll resubmit the licensing applications correctly. Within 48 hours, production will restart. As I straightened my jacket, a shift rippled through the room. The desperation in their postures gave way to deference. They saw now that the path forward lay through me. Exiting the conference room, I caught Troy's eye. His nod was grudging but sincere. Mia offered a tentative smile. Clarice brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her gratitude both personal and professional. Dennis closed the door behind me with a click that sounded like the resetting of a lock. In the corridor, I paused and glanced back at the conference room's reflective glass. Inside, they huddled over their devices and documents, the weight of the emergency meeting lifting slowly. Ardenix Dynamics would survive this crisis because I refused to yield quiet strength for noisy superficiality. And as I walked toward the elevator, briefcase in hand and purpose in my stride, I felt the steady hum of conviction in my bones. They would never again outnumber me in the only territory that truly mattered, the domain of invention itself. Frederick always said that vision without structure is like a house built on sand, and as I walked through the halls of Ardenix Dynamics that afternoon, I carried his words in my mind like a talisman. The boardroom door stood wide open, the polished mahogany table gleaming under the recessed lights. Inside, Troy and Mia hovered over their tablets. Clarice's brow furrowed as she reread the resolution they drafted earlier that morning. They believed they could craft a compromise that would placate the licensing board and preserve their ill-gotten power. What they didn't know was that the true blueprint for Ardenix's governance lay hidden in a document I alone possessed. The Founder's Charter. When Frederick first invited me to review the charter a decade ago, I noticed its incongruity among the scattered prototype schematics and discarded circuit boards. While he and I soldered our first microcontroller prototypes in that dank basement, he had drafted the charter himself, handwriting paragraph after paragraph in his neat script. He had explained then, over the hiss of flux and the weight of late-night coffee mugs, that he trusted me more than anyone to safeguard Ardenix's intellectual backbone. These kids don't understand the gravity of ownership, he whispered. So you'll hold the bones. At the time, I filed away his words, more concerned with refining amplifier noise ratios than legalese. Yet he insisted I sign each page, and I did, unquestioningly. Back in the present, I pressed my suit jacket pocket and withdrew a leather-bound folder. The soft crackle of worn leather echoed in the hush as I placed it on the conference table. Clarice's head lifted first, disbelief flickering in her eyes. Troy leaned back, crossing his arms, while Mia tapped at her tablet to mute the red error alerts. What's that? Mia asked, voice brittle with uncertainty. I unlatched the folder and flipped it open, revealing the Founder's Charter in its original form. Frederick's exact handwriting still legible in places. The margins contained my initials, dated and authenticated. I spread the pages across the table. This, I said, voice firm, is Ardenix Dynamics Founder's Charter as signed by Frederick and co-founders, including myself. Note Article 7, Section 3. In the event of executive leadership failing to uphold the company's technological integrity, inventor control shall revert to the original inventor, who shall possess irrevocable rights to approve all licensing, manufacturing, and development decisions. I paused, letting the words sink in. Clarice traced the clause with a trembling fingertip. Troy's slicked hair seemed to lose its shine in that moment. Mia swallowed, glancing at her tablet as if it could provide a last-minute get-out. I continued, Frederick insisted on this clause a decade ago when the company still operated out of a borrowed storefront. He feared that when Ardenix attracted attention, quick players would try to wrest control from those who built its innovations. He was right. I looked at each of them in turn. You have attempted to override this clause through your board vote. You have attempted to license technology that you no longer license, because licensing authority reverted to me upon your removal of my executive duties. Now you propose amending the charter unilaterally? That's impossible. The charter requires a unanimous vote by all original signatories to be amended. Troy's composure faltered. He glanced at Clarice, who swallowed hard, her confidence crumbling. We didn't know, she whispered. We never read it. I nodded. I know. You dismissed legal footnotes as distractions. You considered my silence an absence of objection, not a subtle assertion of ownership. I closed the folder with deliberate care. But silence is not surrender. It's a shield until you force it aside. Mia's voice quavered as she asked, "What do we do now?" I leaned forward, elbows on the table, and looked each of them in the eye. We do what Ardenix Dynamics has always needed. Respect the tech that built us. We reinstate my position formally, ratify the Founders' Charter in its original form, and notify the licensing board that inventor control resides with me. Then we reapply. I allowed a small smile. After that, we can discuss governance changes, provided they honor the clause requiring unanimous consent by original signatories. Clarice exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing as she reached out to squeeze my hand. I'm sorry, she said, voice thick with regret. I never intended to undermine you. I met her gaze. I know. Then, turning to Troy and Mia, I said, you have two choices. Recognize the Founders' Clause and move forward with transparency, or face the very real possibility that Ardenix cannot function without my authorization. I will not waive my rights, because if I do, I risk the company's future and my own legacy. Troy ran a hand through his hair, eyes downcast. Mia tapped her tablet, clearing the error alerts one by one. Clarice drew a deep breath and nodded. We acknowledge the clause, she declared. We reinstate your title with inventor control intact. We sign the resolution now. Dennis Hawthorne, who had been penciling frantic notes at the table's edge, stood and cleared his throat. I'll prepare the documentation immediately. As Dennis stepped out to coordinate with legal, the room exhaled as one. The oppressive cloud of crisis lifted, replaced by a fragile but genuine sense of collaboration. Clarice offered me a tentative smile that carried the weight of apology and renewed trust. Troy and Mia shared a look that acknowledged their mistake and the relief of resolution. I gathered the Founders' Charter pages, returned them to my leather folder, and slipped it back into my jacket pocket. Standing, I addressed them all with measured finality. Innovation thrives on respect for its foundations. Never forget that Ardenix stands on more than buzzwords and brand campaigns. It stands on invention and on the quiet conviction to protect it. As I left the boardroom, the sun outside cast a shimmer across the glass walls, as if highlighting a new era for Ardenix Dynamics. And in that light, I felt the satisfaction of a man who, through patience and principle, had affirmed that true control belongs to the one who crafts the core of every breakthrough. Troy's hand thundered against the conference table with such force that I half expected the polished surface to shatter, splintering glass and veneer into kindling for his fury. His eyes were dark wells of frustration, a stark contrast to the calm facade he'd worn before my return. Across from him, Mia's manicured fingers twitched over her tablet, the screen reflecting the red-stained projections of stalled sales and mounting liabilities. Clarice sat between them, her face awash with regret, as though she bore the weight of the board's collective miscalculation. It was a moment I had anticipated, rehearsed in the quiet of my own mind, but never once had I allowed myself to revel in the power it afforded me. Even now, I maintained my composure, watching their desperation animate the room. "What do you want, Marcus?" Troy finally bellowed, leaning across to narrow the distance between us. His voice cracked, the strain of leadership he never truly earned suddenly so evident. "Just tell us what it takes to get you back on board fully. We'll sign anything. We'll do anything." His eyes blazed, offering both accusation and plea. I regarded Troy with a measured expression, feeling the familiar hum of tension coil inside me. The polished mahogany under my fingertips was cool, grounding me in the reality of my demands. Too many times in the past I had conceded, smoothed ruffled feathers, and let harmony overshadow principle. Not today. I would not salvage their veneer of authority at the expense of Ardenix's integrity. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice low but unyielding, carrying the weight of every patent clause and legal safeguard I had invested my career in. I stood, smoothing the lapels of my suit jacket as though preparing for a demonstration of equal parts conviction and courtesy. First, you will reinstate me as Chief Innovation Officer with full creative and strategic control over R&D. That role must include unilateral authority to approve any new prototypes, production processes, or licensing negotiations without further board interference. I paused to let the significance of that demand settle in. Second, you will restore the R&D budget to its pre-coup levels, without subjecting expenditures to ad hoc vote or micromanagement by marketing or PR departments. Mia's eyebrows arched in thinly veiled horror at the implication of her own team being cut out of budgetary oversight, but I kept going. Third, you will maintain a policy that no licensing or patent application shall proceed without my written authorization. That policy will be codified in the Corporate Governance Manual and enforced by the head legal counsel. I fixed my gaze on Clarice. And fourth, you will formally acknowledge the Inventor Control Clause in all investor communications, ensuring that no one mistakes Ardenix's capacity without the inventor's consent. I stepped back, placing both hands on the table's edge. You must agree to these terms now, or we will negotiate no further. Silence stretched thicker than any steel alloy we'd ever tested. Clarice's lips trembled as she swallowed against a lump in her throat. Troy's jaw clenched, veins pulsing at his temple. Mia's tablet lay forgotten as her eyes darted between us. I had laid my demand bare, unvarnished by compromise. They were out of options, yet I gave them space to understand the magnitude of what I asked. Troy was first to break. He drew in a ragged breath and nodded stiffly. His pride had been wounded, but business acumen finally prevailed. Agreed, he said through clenched teeth. Mia exhaled sharply, fingers finding her tablet again. Clarice leaned forward, her voice soft but resolute. Yes, Marcus. We will sign the resolution. I picked up the folder I had brought, its spine creaking just enough to punctuate the moment. I withdrew the draft resolution I had prepared in anticipation of this very concession, a codicil to the founder's charter, binding and enforceable. As I moved among them, passing the document first to Clarice, then to Troy, then to Mia, I saw each of them hesitate only a moment before their signatures etched themselves onto the page. The ink was dark, the commitments clear. It was a turning point. The board's desperation had been channeled into necessary realignment. When the final signature was set, I returned the folder to my briefcase. The mood in the room shifted instantly. Where desperation and anger had crackled, a tentative hope now flickered. Investors would see a unified front. Clients would notice the uninterrupted flow of product news. And above all, R&D would breathe again. Thank you, I said simply, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. I closed my briefcase with decisive finality. Clarice reached out and touched my arm, her eyes glistening. I'm so sorry I ever doubted you, she whispered. I offered her a gentle nod. Let's move forward, I replied. Together. Her smile was small but genuine, a bridge spanning the gulf that had threatened to swallow Ardenix. As I left the boardroom, footsteps echoing down the corridor, I sensed the weight of their relief behind me. Production schedules would be retooled, contracts rewritten, and budgets reallocated in short order. But for now, I allowed myself a single moment to acknowledge the significance of what had transpired. They had demanded everything from me in desperation, and I had extracted from them exactly what Ardenix needed to survive and thrive. Out in the lobby, Dennis Hawthorne fell into step beside me, his eyes bright with conviction. That was remarkable, he said quietly. I offered a half-smile as the glass doors parted before us. The afternoon sun streamed in, and I realized that Ardenix dynamics had turned a corner. They would no longer underestimate the quiet one, nor mistake my silence for acquiescence. The master key was firmly back in my possession, and the future of our company was once again secure under the exacting standards that only a true inventor could uphold. When the ink dried on the newly signed resolution, a palpable shift rippled through Ardenix dynamics. The boardroom's stale air cleared as if a window had opened, letting in fresh trust alongside the afternoon light. I gathered my briefcase and prototypes, nodding to Clarice, Troy, and Mia, each of whom now met my gaze without hesitation or doubt. Their expressions mixed relief and resolve, an unspoken acknowledgement that our survival depended on more than flair or bravado. In the days that followed, I reclaimed my office and lab, a sanctuary of soldering irons, oscilloscopes, and half-assembled circuit boards. The familiar hum of equipment greeted me like an old friend, and I breathed in the familiar scent of flux and acrylate. The R&D team trickled back to their benches, their shoulders easing as they saw me step through the doorway. Whispers of welcome back and glad you're here floated across the lab benches. No longer relegated to a corner office under a forced advisory title, I was once again entrusted with the lifeblood of Ardenix's innovation. Clarice invited me to dinner that evening at our home, an olive-wood table and a softly lit dining room where family photos lined the walls. Over roasted salmon and steamed asparagus, she reached for my hand, eyes shining with gratitude. I see now that the loudest voices aren't always the strongest, she said, her thumb tracing gentle circles over my knuckles. You were protecting us in silence. I smiled, tasting both her apology and sincerity. Protection isn't always loud, I replied. Sometimes it takes quiet vigilance. Back at the company, the board acted swiftly to restore our project timelines. Investors received transparent updates, referencing the charter and inventor control clauses to reassure them that Ardenix was back on a secure foundation. Legal counsel distributed amended licensing agreements, and within 48 hours, production lines were to life again. The first batch of neural stabilizer chips rolled off the assembly line, each one tested against the exacting standards I had established years before. Their precision and reliability outperformed our previous runs, a testament to the unimpeded process now in place. Mia oversaw a modest relaunch, eschewing extravagant expos for a targeted demonstration to key medical partners. Instead of fireworks and confetti, she arranged a live webinar where I explained the technical enhancements in plain language. Physicians and engineers asked detailed questions, and I answered each with clarity, my voice steady over the digital feed. This transparency resonated with clients hungry for substance over spectacle. Orders poured in, and the data dashboards glowed green, stability restored, confidence renewed. Troy attended the demonstrations, listening rather than dictating. He took notes on technical specifications, nodded thoughtfully at my explanations, and even asked follow-up questions about future iterations. His earlier swagger had given way to genuine curiosity, and I appreciated the shift. He no longer dismissed the lab as a hidden backwater. He recognized it as Ardenix's engine room. Together, we sketched a phased roadmap for enhancements, each milestone tied to rigorous testing protocols. Clarice spearheaded client relations, leveraging her network to rebuild our reputation. She arranged roundtable dinners with hospital administrators, where she introduced me as the mind behind the machines. Over these meals, I answered questions about neural interface durability and cardiac module safety. Clarice watched as my measured explanations fostered trust that flashy marketing alone could never achieve. At home that night, she admitted, I underestimated how much our clients value expertise. I nodded, appreciating her candor. Within a week, our engineers, now fully funded and free from bureaucratic bottlenecks, innovated new features. A self-calibrating feedback loop that adjusted to patient vitals in real time, and a miniaturized ASIC that reduced power consumption by 20%. These breakthroughs emerged from late-night sessions where ideas flew freely, unhampered by budgetary micromanagement. I oversaw the final prototypes, confirming tolerances with micrometer precision. Each success reaffirmed why Ardenix needed a safeguarded R&D core. Investors responded accordingly, not with catchphrases but with capital. A fresh infusion earmarked specifically for exploration into next-generation neural applications. They cited my reinstatement and the clarified governance structure as the rationale, impressed that Ardenix had turned near catastrophe into renewed momentum. In board meetings, I presented the updated pipeline and risk assessments, my colleagues deferring to my technical expertise rather than dominating the agenda. Late one evening, I walked the empty corridors of our wing, pausing at the lab's glass wall. Inside, the familiar glow of oscilloscopes and brewing ideas welcomed me like a beacon. I placed a hand on the cool glass and whispered, "We're home." The hum of acrylic and algorithm reflected my renewed commitment to protect Ardenix's heart through quiet diligence, to balance vision with structure, and to ensure that our legacy rested on both innovation and integrity. In the end, It wasn't a flashy expo or a viral campaign that rebooted Ardenix dynamics. It was respect for the work done in silence, the unbreakable clauses pinned when our company was young, and the collective resolve to reset and rebuild from a foundation that could never be shaken. And as long as I held that foundation, the company, and the family behind it, would thrive in ways they had only just begun to imagine. Late one evening, long after the lab lights had dimmed and the last of the engineers had filed out, I found Clarice alone at her desk in the corner office, poring over client feedback reports. The soft glow of her computer screen painted her face in muted shades of regret and resolve. She looked up when I entered and offered a small, tentative smile. "Marcus," she said, her voice gentle, "I owe you more than I can ever express." I closed the door behind me and crossed the polished floor, pausing to study the stacks of partnership proposals she'd organized. "You don't owe me anything," I replied quietly, pulling her chair out. "You recognized what I already knew. Innovation needs both vision and structure." She nodded, gathering her papers and setting them aside. "I understand now that being loud doesn't mean being right," she admitted, eyes reflecting the soft amber of the desk lamp. I was so focused on perception that I forgot substance matters most. I sat beside her, looking out at the city lights beyond the tinted glass. "It takes courage to admit that," I said. She reached for my hand, and for a moment we shared a quiet breath, the weight of past mistakes giving way to renewed partnership. In the weeks that followed, the board dynamics transformed almost imperceptibly. At the next quarterly meeting, Troy spoke first, presenting a concise analysis of production metrics that highlighted our recent breakthroughs. His tone was neither boastful nor defensive. It was collaborative. When I raised a question about supply chain optimizations, he paused, nodded, and asked to hear more. That moment, him listening, felt like a turning point. He was no longer the self-proclaimed interim CEO chasing headlines. He was a partner in progress. Mia, too, shifted her approach. Gone were the glossy. During her presentation, she paused mid-sentence to inject a technical aside. As Marcus has demonstrated, our chips hold tolerance variances within plus or minus 2 microns under extreme conditions. The room paused, acknowledging her respect for the engineering details that once seemed beneath her notice. Clarice took the floor last, recounting conversations she'd had with hospital administrators and venture partners. When she introduced me as the quiet force behind every Ardenix innovation, her pride was genuine, not performative. A round of applause followed, warm, appreciative, and devoid of the forced dramatics that once defined our gatherings. I felt gratitude bloom in my chest, not for the recognition, but for the teamwork that had nurtured it. Outside the boardroom, I saw junior engineers pausing in the hall to offer a nod of respect. Administrative staff greeted me with genuine smiles. The office atmosphere had shed its earlier tension. Collaboration had become the new currency. Even in the R&D wing, I overheard conversations about next-generation prototypes, seasoned with casual references to corporate strategy. The lab and the boardroom were no longer separate worlds but parts of a shared ecosystem. That evening, walking back to my office, I passed a framed quote I'd once hung above my workstation. "Silent dedication builds unbreakable foundations." I paused and traced the letters with a fingertip, a reminder of the principle that had guided me through every challenge. It felt surreal that my once private creed had quietly reshaped the culture of an entire enterprise. When I reached my desk, a fresh prototype circuit board waited under its clear casing, accompanied by a mock-up of new packaging design that balanced aesthetic appeal with informative precision. I smiled at the synergy of form and function laid out before me. With careful hands, I lifted the casing and set the board before the microscope, prepared to test its conductivity under simulated stress. The familiar hum of electricity coursing through circuits welcomed me back. This was where I belonged, but now I belonged everywhere. As I adjusted the microscope's focus, a message pinged on my tablet, a notification that our next investor seminar had reached capacity, an achievement attributed to the credibility we'd rebuilt. I thumbed a quick response confirming my attendance, then returned my focus to the microcircuit. The tiny filaments responded to my adjustments perfectly, the output graph settling into a stable waveform. I tapped a command to log the data, satisfied that the engineering integrity held firm under scrutiny. Moments like these, technical, exacting, and profoundly rewarding, were why I had devoted my life to invention. And now, as I sat in my lab, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that respect for my work had shifted the tides not only in the boardroom, but throughout Ardenix dynamics. They had finally learned that the Quiet One was not to be underestimated, because he was the one holding the company's true heartbeat. Last month, when the world was distracted by flashy press releases and celebratory galas, I sat alone in my office, fingers poised above the keyboard. The soft glow of my monitor illuminated patent drafts that had traveled from my basement lab all the way to international patent offices. Each application represented years of research, hundreds of failed prototypes, and the meticulous calibration of every transistor, algorithm, and microscopic trace of conductive ink. I paused at the final claim section of patent number 30, intentionally drafted in the precise legal language that Frederick had taught me to respect. Inventor hereby retains irrevocable control over all licensing, manufacturing, and derivative works. A deep exhale left my lungs as I clicked submit. No fanfare, no press conference, no congratulatory emails flooded my inbox. The world would know in due course, when patent examiners in Geneva, Tokyo, and Sao Paulo appended their seals, and when rival companies sifted through patent databases looking for loopholes that simply did not exist. But in that moment, I savored the quiet efficiency of it, the silent signature that fortified Ardenix's future. My lab coat hung neatly on the back of my chair, dusted with solder residue and flecks of thermal compound. The prototypes on my bench gleamed under the task lamp, waiting for their next iteration. I felt a familiar thrill, protection accomplished. Clarice walked in unnoticed at first, her heels silent on the carpet. She paused behind me, watching the final confirmation message reflect in my glasses. Patent application successfully submitted. I turned, smiling gently at her presence. They'll be processing this for months, I said. By the end of the quarter, these new claims will extend our international coverage into emerging markets. She stepped forward, eyes bright with pride. 30 patents, all under your name, she said softly. They've seen the numbers. Investors are more confident than ever. I slid the patent documents into a locked cabinet and replaced the key in my pocket. It's not about vengeance or showing up the board, I replied. It's about protection. She nodded, understanding the weight of those two words. We walked together down the hallway to the lab, where engineers huddled around a new test rig. As we passed, they offered quiet nods of acknowledgement rather than the clamor of applause. Their respect was measured in trust that every schematic, every code snippet, and every hardware revision would be shielded from corporate power plays. At the lab bench, I picked up the latest neural stabilizer prototype, its housing slimmed by the most recent manufacturing refinements. I ran a fingertip along its smooth edge, remembering the early days when these devices emerged from makeshift molds and 3D printed enclosures that cracked under pressure. Here stood the culmination of a decade's work, refined under policies that ensured inventor control. As I connected it to the waveform analyzer, a steady green line confirmed signal integrity within tolerances tighter than ever before. I allowed myself a moment to appreciate the silence of success. Later that afternoon, Troy sought me out in the conference area, a quiet alcove lined with whiteboards still scrawled with brainstorming ideas. He closed the door behind him. "Marcus, I wanted to say thank you," he began, voice sincere without a trace of the earlier arrogance. "You've given Ardenix a foundation that no one can erode." I regarded him thoughtfully, recalling the day he had declared me an outsider, convinced that my silence masked timidity. "I'm glad you understand now," I said. "Innovation doesn't thrive on noise. It thrives on structure and trust." He offered a firm nod. "Moving forward, I want to support your initiatives, not compete with them." That evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting long orange streaks across our high-rise windows, I reflected on the journey from that dusty basement to global patent filings. I thought of Frederick's frail hand guiding mine as we etched our signatures on the founder's charter. Signatures that still guarded Ardenix from internal power struggles. I envisioned future chapters, devices that interfaced seamlessly with the human nervous system, chips that learned and adapted autonomously, and sensors so small they could monitor vital signs without invasive procedures. All of it secured by inventor control clauses and silent signatures that could withstand boardroom machinations. When Clarice joined me for a late dinner in our kitchen, pancakes and coffee, echoing the morning ritual that once marked my quiet return, I toasted her with a mug that bore the company logo. "To silent victories," I said, raising the mug. She smiled, I was reflecting the warmth of the overhead light. "And to the man who makes them," she replied. Over our meal, we spoke of plans to expand Ardenix's outreach, funding scholarships for biomedical engineering students, and sponsoring hackathons for young inventors. It felt fitting that we celebrate in humble simplicity rather than grand spectacle. In bed that night, I lay awake, listening to the distant hum of city traffic. I thought of Ardenix's future, not in press releases or marketing taglines, but in patent offices, research labs, and hospital wards where our devices would find real-world purpose. My mind drifted to early morning bench tests, late-night code reviews, and the constant hum of innovation guided by principles of ownership and protection. And as sleep claimed me, I knew that Ardenix Dynamics stood on a bedrock no boardroom coup could unsettle, a foundation built not on noise, but on the silent signatures etched in ink and sealed by unwavering conviction.